back to Funding Rural, a show that explores how philanthropy can better serve rural and indigenous communities. I'm Erin Borla with the Sisters Oregon-based Roundhouse Foundation. The Smithsonian has been called the nation's museum. It has a long history as an iconic institution and hub of knowledge and history in our nation's capital and beyond. Nowadays, the Smithsonian has grown to encompass 21 museums, 40 research centers, and the National Zoo. It's the world's largest education and research community. And it's really inspiring to see this important institution prioritizing collaborating with rural America and giving back. To that end, Andy Mink is the Director of Rural Initiatives there. He's the first person to fill this role, and I've enjoyed getting to know him. He's a rural kid, just like I am.
I did grow up in a very small rural community in coastal Virginia on the Chesapeake Bay. Just recently, I went back to visit my parents, who are elderly now. They're in their late 80s. They live in the same house I grew up in. And I asked the population of our small town, and they sort of counted in their head, counted on their fingers, and came up with 61. So it's a small rural space. I also raised my children in rural central Virginia. And so rurality is definitely something, it's a worldview that I think has always informed who I am and infused the work that I've done. The Smithsonian, though, I think is in a unique position as what we call ourselves as the nation's museum, to really treat that phrase not as a slogan or a moniker, but to treat it as a promise and also treat it as a question. And the question is, are we really the nation's museum? Are we really serving communities across the nation? Are we really allowing people of all backgrounds to see themselves in our spaces? Are we addressing what oftentimes is belonging insecurity when citizens don't quite understand if their story is being represented, their story is being told, their perspective is being acknowledged? And so with the conception of this new office, it was really important to me to sort of pull together several of my own personal professional interests, one of which is to serve rural spaces and to serve them from a place of asset building, a place of capacity building, to recognize the unique characteristics of rural environments and the qualities that make them who they are and how they contribute to America and how they contribute to the world we live in. But also to now help this and be a part of an initiative at a globally recognized institution to make its work more available outside of DC. So this work in some ways is both internal and external. And I think there is a component of this where internally the Smithsonian is reimagining how we present ourselves, how we engage our audiences, how we don't restrict ourselves to the confines of 21 museums and 40 research centers, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. That phrase belonging and security is such an interesting one. We talk about authentic voice and narrative and storytelling and who gets to tell the story and whose story is being told and heard by whom. I've never heard it phrased like that. It's really interesting. And I think it really highlights how, we are in a pretty divisive type of time right now where we don't connect with one another. We are more connected than we ever have been, but are yet less connected, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to hear that phrasing of like, how do we solve that? How do we solve for that level of insecurity and what are the tools that we could give to community to be able to support that?
I agree. And, I think the word insecurity also implies that that internally for the audience, for many, many good reasons, there's a notion that other people aren't really ready to listen to us. And if they are, they're really not going to do much about it. And so I think the insecurity comes from just distrust, just not quite understanding or believing or allowing yourself the imagination of knowing that others are there to celebrate and acknowledge and sit by side and really value what you bring to the table versus coming in with a heavy-handed, prescribed, sorry, rural spaces, you're really just big cities unrealized. You just haven't caught up with the rest of us, and we're here to fix that. I think what the Smithsonian has embraced is a very, very different approach, and that is to acknowledge the very unique characteristics of all of the spaces that we hope to work with and serve.
Yeah, and I love that asset based, right? Instead of talking about what's wrong, talking about what's
Mm,
right and how to build off of what's right. And sometimes that brings in how do we better enhance the things that are maybe challenges. You have a couple of exhibits that are already developed around,
mm,
like Crossroads is one,
mhm.
Spark Places of Innovation is
Yeah,
another. Talk a little bit about how you developed those current exhibitions that you have, and they're traveling, so they can go to different places, right?
correct. Yeah, and the other sort of reality of this work is that the Smithsonian has been working in service of rural spaces and communities for a long while, and probably our signature program, Museum on Main Street, which we affectionately call MOMS internally. MOMS has for quite literally 30 years developed deep relationships in small towns in rural America by creating traveling exhibits that reflect content of our museums, but do so in a way that positions the rural space as a central player. The topics that have been chosen generally are agnostic to the space, so we want them to be the big picture questions, things like innovation or water or one voice is one vote kind of topics. And then we work with the State Humanities Council network. Those state humanities councils then receive applications from small towns in their state, and those small towns then host these exhibits for anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks at a time. What we found is that these exhibits, as I think good museum exhibits do, really inspire conversation. They inspire discussion and discourse. And so we have numerous stories and anecdotes and photographs of the communities coming together in public spaces, perhaps a library, perhaps a school cafeteria, perhaps some other central space, interacting with these exhibits, but doing so through the lens of their local storytelling. So people start to remember, they start to tell the stories. This isn't nostalgia. This is exhibits as prompts for local storytelling that's centered in a national narrative. That program is so successful that I want to say that our exhibits are booked through 2030 at this point. They're extremely popular. Communities want them. They want them back. What it's also done, though, and what I'm trying to take advantage of, is building on those relationships. So we have a lot of goodwill. We have a lot of people who, in communities around the country, have seen the Smithsonian show up and hand them a microphone to tell their own story. And what I want to do is build on that, and really focus on this work as it happens at the pace of trust, but a lot of trust is built. And so we want to try to maximize that. This is where the digital age is really beneficial for the democratization of storytelling, right? We can offer people technology and digital means to tell that story. For example, the Moms team has recently been developing what we call starter kits,
Mm.
which are they're not paint by numbers, but they are definitely it's a curriculum in which local communities can then contribute their stories to the Moms exhibits as they tour, as they travel. We're not quite there yet, but I think we imagine being able to develop a repository of these crowdsourced snapshots, so
Yeah.
that if the water exhibit is in my small town on the Chesapeake Bay, then you've got 61 people ready to tell a story and offer an object that contextualizes that in the Chesapeake Bay region, and then it moves on and perhaps collects other voices.
Yeah. Yeah. You taught in a public high school, right?
Public middle school, can you believe it?
Oh, middle school's my
10
favorite.
years, 14-year-olds, absolutely.
Oh my goodness. Well,
Yeah.
and you're up for sainthood for things like that.
I would say
I,
the same of them. Yes,
so was that in a rural space?
it was. Um, yeah, right after grad school, I found myself realizing that I wanted to teach, and I found a position at just a wonderful middle school in Central Virginia, just north of Charlottesville. And it was a rural space, but like all rural spaces, it has nuance. And to your point, it's not a monolith. I certainly had students and families and members of my community who came to school every day with kids who came to school every day with mud on their knees from milking the cows, and they sat next to professor kids who went to University of Virginia. So rurality is such a fluid thing, and where you're located has so much to do with it, but it's also the combination, the collection of people who are there and the perspectives they bring.
Mhm.
But yeah, and my kids were raised there until they were high school age.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of middle school.
Mm,
It
I
tends
am
to
too.
get forgotten in the middle, right?
Yeah, yeah,
We talk about sort of career readiness at the high school level. We
right.
talk about early literacy at the elementary level. And we forget about those sweet kiddos
Mm.
because sometimes they're not so sweet, but that's okay. They'll get there. But I would imagine that experience helped to inform your work now, right? As to how you approach this level of work that you're doing.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I would say in 35 years of professional life, that's probably the most influential part of my professional career is working for that decade with families and students, and many of whom I now know as late 30, early 40-year olds raising their own kids. I think part of it, though, to your point earlier about that middle school culture, is that kids that age, if they have one thing in mind, in my experience, and that is their identity. Who am I? How do I relate to others? How do other people see me? What's the perception that I'm of the presentation I'm giving? If I do this, what kind of response am I going to get? If I do that, is it going to be a different one? And that's both negative and positive.
Mhm.
And I think that sort of identity, which I think can be loosely structured under health in general, is also what communities go through, right? Who are we? How do we fit in? How can we prioritize and acknowledge our identity, our uniqueness, but also allow for new voices and perspectives and growth and change and all these kinds of things. And I found that many rural spaces, including the one I grew up in, really struggles sometimes in a positive way. I mean, struggle in a growth way. Struggles with destigmatizing that living. It's okay to live in a small town. You're not going to be cut off from perspectives and experiences and opportunities others might have, just because you're living here. You can have both. It can be an and or.
Yeah. Well, and that leads in, this podcast is really about how philanthropy can
Mm,
better serve rural and remote spaces. And oftentimes those bigger philanthropic institutions, much like the Smithsonian, are concentrated in larger, more urban centers.
mhm,
And as is a lot of the wealth that's been developed, even if the wealth
mhm,
has been developed in more rural places, it's now concentrated in these urban centers, which has made it hard for those dollars to get redistributed back out to those communities.
mhm,
uh, and I think it's hard for folks that live in places that are not rural for to understand how to engage or connect with those places and in ways that I think are valid and not harmful. Is
mhm,
that I know that's something that you're really working on at the
mhm,
Smithsonian now that you have this newer initiative
mhm,
where you're doing listening sessions and other things. I'm not sure to what level you can share
mhm.
about those types of things or what advice you would have for folks that are trying to get out and trying to do that support work.
Absolutely, and I'll speak specifically from the Smithsonian's perspective and my experience there, and that did start as this office is being developed. That did start with a full commitment to a national rural need sensing research body of work. And so we contracted with an external researcher and began the process of trying to collect as many voices and perspectives from rural stakeholders as we could, just to get a snapshot of how best we can transform ourselves from Smithsonian the destination to Smithsonian the public service, how we can be seen that way. And to our points earlier, we always try to engage these conversations from an asset perspective and also with an acknowledgement that rural is different everywhere. And so we did this in three phases. We started in mid spring, and in each of these examples, these phases, I identified an advocate in that region. The advocate was somebody either I had a prior relationship with or was introduced to by somebody I knew, or somehow could be that gatekeeper that could make sure that the right people were in the room for the first round of conversations. And these were in-person focus groups. We brought together as many as 12, 15, 18 stakeholders from a particular region. The first one was in northeastern North Carolina. That's traditionally known as the Black Belt of North Carolina. Is certainly on the East Coast and in the American South, communities are very close together. So it was relatively easy to bring 15 people from, let's say, 6 or 7 adjacent counties together. These included education leaders, of course, because schools play such an outsized role in small towns and rural spaces, but it also included elected officials and faith-based leaders and chambers of commerce and business leaders, et cetera. And we just quite literally talked to them for 2.5 hours and asked questions about their space, their perspective, their realities, their goals, their aspirations, tried to get a real snapshot of that particular place. We replicated that then in 5 more communities, one in central Maine, that really stemmed from Lincoln, Nebraska. I know Lincoln's not necessarily seen as a traditionally and classically defined rural space, but it does serve a rural population. It's rural adjacent. And also the Bentonville, Arkansas, Springdale area, which is the lower Ozarks. And our final one was actually with Navajo Nation in Window Rock, Arizona. So while we tried to have indigenous voices in all of our focus groups, that one specifically with a geopolitically defined nation, we wanted to get their unique perspective. So we did this with 5, and then we, after that, structured 8 more virtual focus groups that followed the same format. Except as you move to different parts of the country, it's much harder to bring people together face to face. In Montana, it's just too far. And you're in Alaska, you're not going to come down for a 3-hour meeting. So we convened people in a virtual space, had the same kinds of conversations. At the conclusion of that, we developed a survey that reflected the lessons learned and the sort of the key points of those focus group conversations, and distributed that in a double-blind format so it wasn't attached to the Smithsonian name, to about 2,100 rural stakeholders across the nation. At the conclusion of this, we have had voices from every state, as well as Puerto Rico, and we're taking all of that qualitative and quantitative data and developing essentially a final report that we can then use to activate our work in rural spaces. It can be a guidepost. Internally, it's going to give me a lot of good feedback that I can share with museums and directors at the Smithsonian as they develop their rural outreach kind of work. I'm sorry, again, I'm going to resist using the word outreach, our rural collaborations, but I'm also going to use it to begin conversations in rural spaces around work we can do locally and regionally. So this was a really important part of the rural initiative in general, that we have this spine of evidence and research behind it. Of course, it's not comprehensive. I mean, we're complicated people, and these are snapshots of areas that give us guidance, that give us something to evolve from. But it's really going to be an important part of 2025-26.
No, I think it's really interesting how you've chosen to go to those different places and collaborate with those communities. Can I ask just a brief question?
Yeah, of course.
What's the resistance to the word outreach? Because I think it's super beneficial for other folks to hear that.
Yeah, this is part of what came up in the focus groups. And again, it's, I don't mean to backfill evidence. I'm not trying to hear the things that I want to now be able to say to you and to others. But, I think rural spaces, I think any community always begins with, if not suspicious, at least guarded, optimistic interaction with people from the outside, from people not from here. Where I grew up, anybody not from there was a come over. Like, you came across the bay to be there. And because I wasn't born there, I moved there when I was 3. I'm still a come over. So yeah, you have to sort of get that validation. And what I have heard in all of these focus groups is a real belief that any attempt, particularly by Washington, D.C., and even though the Smithsonian is a different kind of federal institution, the Smithsonian itself, any attempt to come in from that perspective and save us or help us or bring your world here meets with resistance. And the word outreach itself to some people implies that kind of almost patronizing, sort of being condescending about it. It's the old commercial that you and I heard when we were kids. Where's that from? New York City. Like, nobody wants that city stuff coming in unless you prove your worth, unless you prove that you're here for the right reasons.
Yeah. We say, unless you have dirt on your boots, right?
Exactly.
52% of U.S. cultural organizations are in small towns or rural communities.
Mm-hmm.
82% of rural cultural organizations have an annual budget of under $25,000.
That's right.
How are we getting the information from the Smithsonian to folks that are probably volunteer-led?
Yeah.
Or how do those volunteers access those resources? What's the connection point?
Yeah, that's a great point. And this will bring us back a little bit to the report that we discussed a few moments ago, because it's really my intention, our intention, that this report not be just a static PDF that's in my file and we can feel good about, or a book on the shelf, so to speak, but rather we activate it in local and regional public service. And so as I'm going through all the data and I'm reviewing the report itself, I'm seeing key themes, key goals that are emerging from most, if not all, small towns and rural spaces, things that they have in common. Of course, individually and in unique places, they're going to have their own sort of variables in that, but many of them are saying things like, wow, we care so much about our local identity. We care so much about our material culture and our history. And to your point, we have these museums or small cultural organizations, but they're woefully undersourced. Their capacity as staff is limited, maybe by training, maybe by access to materials and resources, whatever it may be. What are we going to do about that? So our plan is to take this report and bring out, let's say, a menu of 6, 8, even 10 of these key themes, these key stated goals, and then match them with what the Smithsonian does really well. And then find a local partner, a regional partner, and host. I'm bouncing back and forth, Aaron. I used to call these convenings. I'm starting to think of them more as accelerators or incubators, but essentially go to a rural region and focus on one of those topics, bring in Smithsonian expertise and resources, and invite local stakeholders to develop the project to address that goal. And then we bring in the opportunity for funding of that project. So as an example, we identify a region or a small town, a rural space that really wants to work on improving its cultural organizations, because they just don't have the resources they need, because there are new people moving into their town and they want them to understand the long heritage of this place. They want to integrate them in their perspectives. And we set up a 2-day incubator, 2-day accelerator, and we bring the right people in the room and say, what could this look like? This might look like professional development for your staff, or this might look like an internship where you send staff to the Smithsonian fully paid, and they learn the best practices of archival work or cultural preservation. Or we want to create a course at the local community college that focuses on whatever the solution is that they come up with, and then we're there as partners. And so we can begin to address locally these stated goals by giving them actual project work. And it's not one-offs, it's long-term relationship building. That's the goal of the report. And I suspect that there'll be many spaces that want to do some kind of cultural preservation work. In particular, I've just recently had conversations with good colleagues in Western North Carolina who are interested in disaster preparedness and disaster recovery preservation work after Hurricane Helene. Imagine all the rural spaces with fires and hurricanes and storms and all the things that are going on. And they're maybe starting to think about, like, we should probably do some cultural preservation work before it happens, not after we lose all of the material culture of our history and our place.
Yeah.
So we're planning to address that very directly. Of course, we also have America 250 coming up, and we're hoping that a lot of small towns who have interest in seeing how they can commemorate that will see us as public service partners.
Yeah, that is coming up. Oh my goodness. Well, and here in Oregon, the Heritage Commission just released their vitality study, which was talking with all of our regional cultural museums and projects. And that's definitely something that came up, was the disaster preparedness. And when you have smaller organizations that are often volunteer led, and we have high risk of fire, we have high risk of flood and other things on our coastal communities. It's how do we prepare those folks? And maybe they're not as technologically savvy, even if our state office has those tools or the Smithsonian has the tools. How do we provide them that next step? And that's something that maybe philanthropy could step in on as well. If there are ways to, even if those tools exist, help spread the word, help connect folks. Are there other things that you see where philanthropy could provide sort of that bridge or that gap opportunity?
Yeah, that's a great bridge to this part of the conversation, because if you take the example I just gave, and we invited cultural organizations of a region to come together and start to identify their needs and their goals. I think, just as you suggested, they probably would fall into various buckets. One would be training, professional development sorts of things. One might be materials and resource and access to the stuff of preservation. The other might be experiential. It might be things like internships in Washington. My job, the job of Rural Initiative, is to connect those interested partners with the experts we have. For example, one of our units is called the Museum Conservation Institute, and it does a lot of work in communities all over the country of exactly what you're suggesting. How do we train, particularly in the face of disasters, with the acknowledgement that disaster is going to happen? And disaster, by the way, happens in short term and long term. So there's the disaster of the fire. There's the disaster of generations lose touch, elder folk die, people evolve, whatever it may be. So there's lots of different ways to address that. And what I would do is work directly with the MCI team and that community to develop the program that matters. And that's where local philanthropists matter. The Smithsonian would not work with them to receive money, but we would work with the local philanthropists to invest in those local initiatives, to really invest in their local communities. And what we found as well is that in many small towns, and this is just a product of capacity and experience, they don't always know or have the staff to write a grant, manage a grant, handle all the architecture and infrastructure of receiving a big chunk of money. So we would also be there to provide that kind of guidance and work with local foundations, donors, philanthropists to match them up. It's not Shark Tank, but it kind of is, right? You're designing a project.
Yeah.
You've got all the right partners in place. You've got the stated goal, clear outcomes, clear need, clear benefit, and then you're sharing it with a potential funder. And they then can see where their local investments can really make a difference and move the needle.
Yeah. And it's building those connections and offering those opportunities. I think, I was on a board for a really long time, a fundraising board. And they asked me at one point, it was a big board. There were like 30 folks. And they said, you should come and teach everyone how to ask for money. You're good at it.
Yeah.
Because I used to be a fundraiser in the past. And I said, well, it's not hard. You don't go in and just say, I need money. You go in and you're on this board because you're passionate about the project. You're passionate about the work that you do. And if you share that passion, the ask becomes very easy.
That's right.
And it's kind of coaching folks where they think it's this constant ask. It's this sharing of your passion, and whether that's passion of community, passion of culture, passion of the museum, but then also this opportunity to say, and here's what we need.
That's right.
We need our roof repaired. We need to, digitize all of our photographs.
That's right.
We need the opportunity to connect it with greater institutions outside of our community or share our story. And I think that's been a really interesting component, is one, being able to encourage folks to share that message, that their story has validity beyond their community, beyond their region. And I think you phrased it before with looking over the horizon. And there's that moment of like, what you do is important.
That's right. And that's where the speed bump of belonging and security crops up all of a sudden, when exactly as you described, seeing the value, knowing that others will see it as well, and then hitting that perceived challenge of, well, they kind of don't, or my story is not important enough, or why would they give me money to do these things that they're important. One of the things that came up in the quantitative side of our research is that the Smithsonian brand and name is very well recognized across the nation in rural spaces, and generally has a very, very positive association. By very, I mean upper 80%. And so even if they don't always know what it is and what it does and what its purpose is. So I think we're also hoping and believing that the Smithsonian itself, the brand itself, can be a catalyst in these conversations, that just simply being in these conversations, being at these convenings and offering our side-by-side support will begin to open those eyes, as you're suggesting, to why this is important to other people in other places. We asked many of the members of our focus groups to describe their community and sort of to give us their impressions of what it meant to live there. And it was very, very common, if not unanimous, that we heard stories of people saying, I'm there to help you if you need help. If I drive by your truck and it's in the ditch, I'm not going to look to see what bumper sticker you have on, what political identity you have. I'm not going to see, how old you are. I'm going to stop and I'm going to help you out of the ditch. All those other things aren't what define the way that in many of our projects we call it the little d democracy, right? It's the ways that people get along. It's just living together in a civil environment, and I think rural spaces do that as well as, or maybe even better than most, because we have to, because you are in each other's lives in all ways, and you have to figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah, you see each other at the post office. You see each
Sure
other at
do.
the grocery store, at the pickup line for school. And I don't know, I always use the phrase of, regardless of what sign's in your yard, if your barn's on fire, we'll be there and
Exactly.
first at the door with a casserole or whatever you need. So you grew up rural and
Mm.
now you're in DC ish. I mean, you travel back and
Ish.
forth,
Yeah.
have a
Yeah.
role that's in DC.
That's right.
What advice do you have for folks that want to do this work, want to begin this work in rural places, whether they're philanthropists, whether they're institutions similar to yours? Like, what's the best first step and second step, maybe?
Yeah, so I've got my own impressions, which I'm pleased are being verified and certified and justified through this rural need sensing report. But I think one of them certainly is that you have to go to these places. Zoom meetings, virtual meetings, digital communication. That's great when you start doing the work, but you've got to go places and sit with people and walk their streets and see their world and really be willing to invest that time. I think that's one of the first critical pieces. I also think that we, as an institution, always need advocates. That isn't always a single person. Oftentimes, it's another institution: the library, the school, the church, in many places. But there needs to be someone or some institution that can understand and partner and vouch and code switch for the uniqueness of that place, so that when the Smithsonian is there, that we're being introduced to the right conversations. And by right, I mean inclusive, well represented, authentic conversations. I think it's important for institutions of the size of the Smithsonian to really work hard to understand what we're doing in communities. It's very easy to have 8 or 10 different units all doing things and sort of forgetting that we're in the same places sometimes, and there's nothing more. You don't lose credibility any more than when you show up in a place and you realize, oh, wait a minute, there was a Smithsonian something here a month ago and I didn't know about it. I think that's really important.
We see that a lot with institutions like higher ed,
Absolutely.
because it's very siloed even within the institution to
Yeah.
say, oh, well, someone was just here from XYZ University. Really? I didn't
Yeah.
know that.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think just in general, I think any of these conversations, because they're all designed to become actionable work. We can talk about aspirations all day long, but you got to do the work too and be prepared to do it and be there for the long term and handle all the challenges and help communities outside of our Smithsonian world understand how to navigate the systems and all those things. But we have to do it from a place of humility and a place of really shared and mutual respect. And I think what the Smithsonian does really well is tell stories with respect in a non-divisive, in a meaningful way in Washington. And now we're as we move into spaces across the nation, I think we're bringing that same perspective.
So in 10 years, where do you think this office that you're sitting in is going to be?
Well, I always want to make myself indispensable, so this is not the right answer for me personally, but I hope it's invisible. And what I mean by that is I hope that this notion of working in support of and in service of communities across the nation is just embedded in the ways that the Smithsonian sees its work, imagines its new projects and programs, makes connections across the country that we build on, I would love to see that to perhaps be represented in different ways we manage our work. For example, what if we began to think about placing Smithsonian employees not in DC, but in these communities? What if there was a Smithsonian employee, placed in Oregon to help with, culture burns with the indigenous population or whatever it may be? So when I say invisible, what I mean is that it's just part of the way that we see our work rather than being so intentional right now. I hope it becomes much more natural.
We talk about that a lot as folks are building, you have a convening and you're building a panel and you're making sure the panel is diverse in a variety of ways. That geographic diversity is also a really important piece and a very simple way to include rural voice.
That's right.
Because different things impact communities that are smaller or further away from where decisions are made or where resources are differently. So that's, I think, just a beautiful way to be more invisible. I love that. Well, thanks for taking time to chat today. I've loved being connected to the work that you're doing and hearing all about what's happening at the Smithsonian and the work that you're doing beyond DC and beyond the walls of the institutions and the research centers. So thank you for spending time.
Erin, thank you so much, not only for having me, but for doing this work. And, what I found is that work like this podcast and the conversations that we're trying to inspire, it really does come from just continuing to move the discussion forward just a little bit. And I'm hopeful that this will be the first of many times that we talk.
Thanks so much. We've talked a lot throughout different episodes on this show about how to communicate with rural folks, how to get to rural places. And we hear time and time again, just go, show up, sit with folks, go to places, meet the right folks, or find the gatekeepers. Who are the true community leaders? Walk the streets, go have a cup of coffee, enjoy happy hour. There's all sorts of ways to get involved. And that's the first step, is showing up. Andy mentioned even maybe putting employees in some of those places. That's another thing we've talked about on this show. How do we drive new staff for our organizations from rural communities to show up or work from different places? One thing that I think we touched on quite a bit in this episode is talking about the story of us as a country. And what the Smithsonian is doing is trying to tell that story that both connects urban and rural Americans as Americans. We have so much more in common than in opposition. I also wanted to touch on, I think, the really important piece that the preservation component, as we face several natural disasters, whether it's wildfire or flood or hurricanes, we really need to look at preserving some of those heritage items. And so how do we do that? What are ways philanthropy can step in and help? Some technical assistance, professional development, providing resources on how to digitize photographs or other materials. Those are things that I think we really need to think about sooner rather than later as a collective. And lastly, belonging and security. What a fantastic phrase. And how does it impact so many different people and so many different topics? And how are we all drawn together with that one phrase? Thanks for listening. Check out all of our resources at fundingrural.com.